Real-time feedback into the behavior of your distributed systems and observing changes, exceptions, errors in real time allows you to not only experiment with confidence, but respond instantly to get things working again.
Hey everybody, it's Travis Waith-Mair, and today I'm going to be giving you an intro to Solid.js for React developers or anyone else. Now quickly, a little bit about me. I'm Travis Waith-Mair. I'm at Twitter at Travis Waith-Mair in camel case, and I have a blog at nontraditional.dev. I work for Plex, and I also am the creator of the Bedrock Layout Primitive Library that is originally written in React, but is also has a port over in Solid.js. Now, Solid.js has a very familiar API to React. In fact, anyone who's written a React app, just looking at this code with no explanation, probably can figure out what's going on. It's pretty easy. And that's because of that very familiar API that it has from React. Because for one thing, Solid.js uses JSX, it uses components, and it uses props. And all of it is very similar to the way React does. In fact, if you look at this very simple component, very contrived component, you wouldn't know if this is a Solid component or a React component because it works either way. They also has, Solid also has an API that's very familiar to hooks. So it has a bunch of these reactive primitives. And if we look here, this create signal looks very much like a use state. Create effect feels very much like use state. And so that very familiar API that you have in React translates very well over into Solid. Now, before we go on, I do want to emphasize that Solid is not a drop-in replacement for React. You cannot just import from Solid instead of React like other frameworks, for example, Preact. But you can take a lot of that familiarity and intuition that you've learned from React and hit the ground running in Solid. What makes Solid.js different than React is how it's built under the hood. And the biggest thing is it's built on reactivity instead of the virtual DOM. See, the React Virtual DOM, if you're not already aware, works something like this. This is a very simplified version, but it effectively works like this. You have components, something changes state in any of those components, it gets flagged by the virtual DOM that it needs to change. And then eventually it re-renders. The whole time all that happens, the browser DOM is only impacted at the actual rendering stage. This is where React tries to be efficient because it can do more and do more quickly in memory with a virtual DOM, and then only change the actual DOM when it actually needs to. Solid.js, on the other hand, doesn't have a virtual DOM. And instead will surgically update only those parts of the apps that are dependent on the reactive values. And when those reactive values change, it will surgically go in and update that. Well, how does it do that? What's the magic? Well, Solid.js is a compiled framework, which, let's be honest, everything is a compiled framework nowadays. Even React, you're not actually technically writing JSX, you're compiling that to React create element calls. But it's in that transpilation that with their fine-grained reactive primitives that Solid.js will do all that wiring up for you. So you just write the code how you want. That feels very pragmatic, very intuitive. And Solid.js under the hood, when it gets transpiled, will do all that wiring up for you. See, in Solid.js, it's all about the primitives. There are components in Solid, but they're not the foundation like they are in other frameworks. In fact, with Solid, the component actually disappears. Your component only renders once and then it never renders again. It's the fine-grained reactive primitives that Solid.js is built on that make everything happen. And in fact, everything in Solid can be broken down into one of three primitives. It's either a signal, a memo, or an effect. A signal is, simply put and easy to think about, is a function that returns a value. So when we use create signal, we get a signal and a setter for that signal. And then we call it, we get the value just by calling the function. And then if we want to set it, we would call the setCount function in this example. Effects, on the other hand, allow us to do effects based on those signals and when they update. And so in here, we're updating the document.title to whatever the current count is. And now you'll notice coming from React, you're going, where is that dependency array? Well, there's none needed because that create effect already knows to rerun only if the count signal is updated. And then memos are kind of an amalgam of both an effect and a signal. See, it will only rerun if any of those signals that it depends on actually update. And then it returns a signal itself that you have to call to get the value. So obviously the memos, by its name, work best for expensive calculation. And you'll notice, just like the create effect, no dependency array. So let's just go through this simple counter function. We have a create signal at the beginning. We have count, set count. We have an effect that will update the document.title whenever the count is updated. And then we have some JSX. One is a paragraph that will tell us what the current count is, and a button that when we click it will increment the counter. Once again, feels very familiar to the way we build things with React. The cool thing though is that every time we hit that set count, we don't rerun this entire counter function. The only thing that gets updated is that effect reruns, and then that paragraph JSX re-updates. And that's it. Nothing else is even touched. Primitives don't follow the rules of React. They're not, because components are only ever run once and never run again. There's nothing to say that we can't conditionally call an effect. We can't conditionally call a primitive in a hook to do any of the stuff that I'm doing here in this example. If we were doing this in React, these would break your app. But with Solid, this is totally fine. And in fact, you notice that the signal we pulled out of the component and brought it into a more global area of the module. This is a very common way to create a global state. You just pull the signal out of the component, and now it's available to be imported into any component. And those components will both be kept in sync because they're dependent on the same signal. Now, it's important to note that even though this is a common way to update state, to have global state, there are more complicated ones that handle more sophisticated use cases. And all of that's available in the API in the docs at Solid.js. Now, there are gotchas if you're coming from React, if you're a React developer. And I like to use this example when explaining that. As an English speaker, Spanish has a lot of false friends. For example, the word university in Spanish is universidad. In English, we have the word president, and in Spanish, it's presidente. And in English, we have the word embarrassed. So we might think the word for embarrassed in Spanish is embarazada. But any of my Spanish-speaking friends who are listening to this would know embarazada means pregnant, not embarrassed. So sometimes familiarity will create us a false sense of confidence and will break things if we're not aware. So just in the same way, Solid has its false friends for React developers. So let's look at one of the most common ones. Don't return early in Solid.js components. Remember, Solid.js only runs their components once. And if you return early, the rest of that component is never run, and hence the reactivity and all that stuff that happens under the hood never happens. And therefore, even though that prompts.data gets updated, we never actually get that reactivity and go on to the rest of the component because the component never reruns. So what you want to use instead are control flow components. Solid.js has several control flow components to help us do the things that we normally would have done otherwise in React without breaking reactivity. In this example, we're using show, that when prompts.data exists, it will show its children, and then it has a fallback in case it doesn't. And there are control flow components like switch, for, error boundaries, and suspense. Now, another thing you don't want to do inside a Solid.js component is do logic outside of the reactive primitives or outside of JSX. You can always do logic inside of an effect, a memo, or any other primitive, or JSX, and it works great. But as soon as you do it outside of that, such in this example, we're deriving a double count value from our count signal, that value gets lost in the scheme of things. That wiring up of reactivity never happens. So what we want to do, we can derive the value, for example, in a function. If we put it in a function, then the function can, since it's ultimately called in the JSX in this example, that reactivity still gets wired up just fine. Or better yet, if you can, if it makes sense, just put it right into the JSX. And that also works. Now, this is a big one that happens pretty much to every new React developer when they come into Solid.js. And that's because it is common in React to destructure your props, either directly in the component signature or immediately react right after. And both of these are no-nos. And you might go, why does that break reactivity? Well, if you think about it, prop values could be reactive. And I'm going to give you a little peek under the hood of what happens when your prompts do have a reactive value. Under the hood, Solid.js will see that. And instead of doing a regular property value like the salutation that says hello, it will actually do a getter that will return the value that is called. So whenever that prop value name gets called, it's actually calling the signal username under the hood. So essentially, every prop value needs to be treated as if it was a signal. So instead of destructuring them, and either in the signature or directly from the prop.value, the props, just go ahead and put your props directly in the JSX. Now, sometimes we do need to manipulate the props, and we need to split values or merge values. And in that case, there are utility functions called split props and merge props that allow you to safely split or merge those props without breaking that reactivity. And one that I think is very great, because there is no don't do in this case, but in Solid.js, because your components only ever run once, you don't need to have useRef or use callback. You can just assign your refs to a value, or you can pass functions directly into your components, and you don't have to worry about having callback, doing use callback, because you don't have to worry about your component rerunning and having to make sure you get the same exact ref or the same exact callback function. So don't go looking around for useRef or use callback or an equivalent, because they don't exist, because they're not needed. Now, after giving you all those gotchas, you might be like, well, it's not worth it. That's too much to remember. Just like React has a linter for React hook rules, Solid.js has its own linter to help you make sure you don't break reactivity. Now, one might go, well, why bother? React is at the top. There's the highest market share. Solid.js is this just new up-and-coming thing. Why even bother learning it? Well, Solid.js has the highest satisfaction rating according to the State of JS in the 2021 results. And this is because it was the very first year that it was actually on the list. It beat out every other framework in its first year. It's also very performant by default. Ryan Carniato, the creator of Solid.js, loves being performant, but not at the expense of developer experience. And because of that, he's built this fantastic API that you don't have to worry about performance. It does it for you. There's already a robust ecosystem. If you go to solidjs.com/ecosystem, you can see there's already multiple routers, UI components, tooling, starters. A lot of the things that already exist in other frameworks already exist in Solid.js as well. So you can build a full-on app without having to worry about whether there's a plugin or an ecosystem that is going to support your app. By the way, here's a shameless plugin for Solid Bedrock Layout, which is my port of my React library over to Solid.js. And there's also, in the works, is in beta right now, but there's a meta framework just like Remix or Next. And it is built on Solid. It's called Solid Start, and you can go check that out at this link. So where do I go from here? You're like, I'm sold. I want to learn all about Solid.js. Well, great place is solidjs.com. That's the doc site. Specifically, I would like to recommend that you go to the tutorial. It'll go through all the basics and you can really get into it, as well as there's a playground where you can learn and just play around with Solid.js and mess with the reactivity and see how it works. And then, of course, there's a Discord for Solid.js. Highly recommend. It's a fantastic community of developers who support each other. And that's it. Thank you. I'd like to thank you for the time here and hope you enjoy the other talks at the conference. Once again, my name's Travis Waith-Mair at Travis Waith-Mair on Twitter, and I blog at nontraditional.dev. Hope you have a great one.